He wasn't building anything. He was digging a grave, his own. Then 5 silent girls came walking through the wind. No tears, no past, just one line. We just need a roof. And in that moment, the man who thought he was done paused and didn't leave. Part 1. A hole in the frozen ground. The cold was not new. It had settled into Boone Thatcher's bones long before the first frost of winter crept in, before the snow dusted the flat-roofed cabin like sugar spilled on a counter. Cold had lived in him for 10 years, since the coughing took Ellie, and the fever took his boy, and silence claimed what was left. This morning the sky was a hard, pale gray, the kind that made the sun feel far off, as if it had quit trying. Boone walked with a spade slung over his shoulder, not hurried, not slow, just moving. The earth behind the cabin had frozen halfway through, but the topsoil, softened by a rare spell of sun, gave way with effort. He didn't grunt or groan as he dug, just kept at it. One scoop, another. He wasn't old, not yet, but the beard had gone to iron and his hands looked like rawhide, cracked, dark from sun, cold, stiffened. He wore the same coat he had when they'd lived, when Ellie sang in the morning and his son Jacob ran barefoot out the back door, a wooden toy horse dragging behind by a string. But those sounds had stopped. The grave was not for them. They already had their resting place. 2 stones up on the ridge where the sagebrush still tried to grow. This one? This was for him. He didn't plan to shoot himself or hang or make a scene. Boone had never been the dramatic sort. He was going to lie down when the cold was deep enough to do it quick, just one breath too many into the hard Wyoming night. That was all. He paused between shovelfuls, eyeing the cross he'd shaped the night before. Birchwood, soft and pale. Carved into the grain with the tip of his blade were 6 small words: I once had a family. It leaned now against the pile of snow like it was ashamed to stand straight. Boone sat on an upturned bucket, the handle rusted and biting into his thigh. He looked out over the land, not much to see. A few naked trees, the barn slumping to one side like it had given up holding its own roof. The chimney was still smoking, though no one waited inside, just him and the silence. He drank a swallow from a canteen, cold water with a film of ice along the rim. Then, after a long while, he stood and drove the spade back into the ground. It would take a few more hours, maybe a day, but he had time. No one was waiting. No one would come, or so he believed. It was close to dusk when he heard it, not the sound of hooves or wagon wheels, but the soft crunch of something light walking careful through snow. He lifted his head. His hand went to the rifle leaning against the split-rail fence, though he didn't rise yet. Out by the ridge, 5 shapes emerged. Small ones, children, girls. Their clothes were too thin for the wind. Boots, if they had them, were mismatched. Soles hanging open like mouths that hadn't spoken in days. Their coats were more patch than fabric, sleeves sewn with whatever thread someone could find. One girl, no older than 10, carried another on her back, piggyback style. The smallest one clutched a doll, missing its head. Boone didn't speak. He watched. They stopped just beyond the edge of his clearing. The tallest among them stepped forward. Thin frame, dirt-smudged cheeks, eyes too old for her years. She said plainly, "We just need a roof for the night." Boone looked past her, at the 4 behind. None of them looked scared, not defiant either, just tired. He glanced back at the hole he was digging. He could have said no, could have pointed back toward the ridge and said, "Try town," but he didn't. Instead, he reached down, lifted the shovel, and rammed the blade into the snow. Not to keep digging, not yet. Then he turned toward the cabin. He didn't beckon, didn't offer a word, but he left the door unlatched, and that, for now, was enough. Part 2. 5 Shadows at Dusk. The grave behind the cabin sat open like a wound in the snow, its edges crisp from the cold, untouched by the wind that had carried off most things Boone Thatcher once held dear. He hadn't covered it, couldn't. The birchwood cross still leaned beside it, waiting to be planted like a sentinel that didn't care which way the story ended. The shovel stood nearby, blade half buried in frozen earth. His hands, calloused and worn, had stilled hours ago. He just sat there now, not even pretending to keep busy, only breathing because his body hadn't yet learned how to quit. Then came the faint crunching of frost underfoot, not heavy like a man, not hurried like a thief. Lighter, measured. Boone didn't turn right away. The sound moved down the slope behind the cabin, closer. 5 sets of footsteps coming around from the north ridge where no one ever came in winter. He finally looked up. What he saw wasn't a posse or a threat. Wasn't salvation, either. Just 5 girls. Dirt smudged, eyes shadowed, cheeks hollow from wind and hunger. They stood in a crooked line at the tree line like they weren't sure if the house was real or just another mirage too cruel to chase. The oldest couldn't have been more than 13, with braided hair that had long since unraveled into knots. She stepped forward, her boots too big, her coat barely stitched at the seams. "We just need a roof for tonight," she said. Her voice wasn't pleading. It was steady, dry, worn thin like a thread pulled too many times. Boone blinked slowly. His eyes dropped to the smallest one, who clung to a headless rag doll, her nose running, her eyes wide but unfazed. The middle ones, 3 of them, stood still as fence posts. One held a small wooden spoon. Another had her hand bandaged with a man's handkerchief, tied in the awkward way of children, caring for each other. They didn't move closer. He stood, shoulders stiff, knees popping. His boot scraped the edge of the grave. The sound made the girls flinch, just a little, like stray dogs who'd learned not to trust even the sound of kindness. Boone looked at the shovel, then back at them. "No one's here but me," he finally said. His voice, when it came, was low and rusty, like a hinge that hadn't turned in years. "And a hole I ain't ready to lie in just yet." The eldest girl looked behind her, then stepped forward slowly. "Then maybe just the barn." Boone took a breath. Cold filled his chest like dust in a dry well. The barn's colder than inside. He turned and walked toward the cabin. He didn't say they could follow, but they did. Inside, the cabin was more silent than space. 1 bed, 1 table, 1 stove still warm from a fire he'd let burn out too soon. A few chairs, too many for 1 man, not enough for 6 people. Boone stirred the last of the cornmeal mush he'd left on the stovetop that morning and ladled it into whatever bowls he could find. Tin. Wood. 1 chipped porcelain cup. The girls didn't fight for it. They didn't speak. They just took their places on the floor in front of the stove, each holding their meal like it was a ritual they'd memorized. He leaned against the counter, arms folded, staring at them like he was trying to make sense of ghosts. "Got names?" he asked after a while. The eldest nodded. "I'm Sadie." She nudged the one with the rag doll. "That's Fern. Tilly's behind her. Then Josie, she didn't talk. And Mabel, she's the quiet one." Boone raised a brow. "Ain't they all?" Sadie didn't smile, but she looked him in the eye. They ate without speaking further. Boone didn't sit with them. He stayed by the window, watching the frost form on the glass, as if waiting for something else to come out of the woods. Nothing did, but something had already entered. Later that night, Boone laid a few thick wool blankets in the loft. The girls climbed up without question. No thank you, no need. They weren't used to soft words. Downstairs, Boone sat near the hearth, an old whiskey bottle unopened by his boot. His hand hovered near it, then didn't lift. He looked at the grave again, now hidden in the dark outside the window, still open, still waiting. But it didn't seem so certain anymore. Not tonight. Part 3. The Empty House. With too many chairs. Morning sunlight crept through cracks in the cabin's roof, catching motes of dust in its pale beams. It was quiet, too quiet, but Boone had come to know that silence, once thick enough to suffocate memory, could also cradle a seed of something new. The girls were already awake. Sadie was sweeping ashes from the hearth, her motions steady and necessary. Tilly washed Fern's tangled hair in a tin basin, warm water clouded by the dirt of days spent walking. Mabel sat by the window, tracing frost patterns with her finger. Josie watched them, expression unreadable, small hands folded in lap. Boone was awake before any of them. He sat by the table staring at the 4 chairs he'd left to empty, chairs for a family that no longer existed. He rose and stood beside Sadie. Without a word, he placed a bowl of cornmeal mush before her. Only then did he sit and pour one for himself. No words. Just breakfast. Fern watched Boone take a bite. He lifted a spoon to her mouth. She took it, a small gesture, and yet it shifted something in the cabin. After breakfast, Boone repaired the chairs one by one, whittling wood shavings onto the floor. He sanded a broken leg with the blade of his knife, then lashed it with cloth and wax. Sadie helped. Their hands brush, wood, wool, care, and something warm passed between them. He fixed the second chair with a piece of broken fence board, steady strokes guided by determination. The third with splintered barn planks. He sang no songs. He told no stories. This was heavy, honest labor. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutter. Inside, the click of hammer and scrape of cloth became a rhythm that grounded him. Once all chairs were fixed, he placed them around the table. He pulled one out and looked at it, no one to sit there but him. Then he turned, and with quiet effort, lifted Sadie onto the seat. She looked startled. "Sit," he said softly. Sabotaged dignity accepted in the curve of her wrists. She sat, unsure. Her eyes flicked to his. He nodded once and sat across from her. They didn't speak until Tilly came down carrying a loaf of stale bread. She plunked it on the table and broke off pieces, handing one to each of them. Mabel, Josie, even Fern. It wasn't a feast, but there were 6 of them, and for the first time in years, Boone counted 6. Their eyes met across the table. No words exchanged, but the room felt warmer. The chairs no longer echoed emptiness. Later, Boone fetched an oil lamp and lit it. The cabin flickered in its glow, wood-grained, soft, and alive. He stood before it, watching the reflection of 5 small faces, trust and fatigue painted in flickering amber, and a man whose eyes lit with something that hadn't breathed in too long. He spoke then, quietly. "Looks like there's a place for you here." Sadie smiled, a small, uncertain curve. Josie touched his hand, gentle and sure. No words needed. Fern crawled onto Boone's lap, her doll held tight but no longer clutched in fear. Tilly wrapped both arms around his neck. Mabel offered him more bread without asking. At that moment, the house, long empty, felt full. Outside, the skiff of wind shook the trees, but inside, the warmth stayed. No one spoke of the grave. No one needed to. The chairs held them close. The house listened, and Boone, for the first time in forever, felt a reason to stay. Part 4. Warmth without asking. The fire burned low, throwing long, gentle shadows against the cabin walls. Outside, the Wyoming wind slipped through pine and brush like a dog that had lost its scent. It was one of those late winter nights where the cold didn't bite so much as seep, quiet and steady into bone, into floorboards. into places memory liked to live. Boone Thatcher sat by the hearth, boots off, a tin cup resting between his hands. The girls had finished the mush and bread earlier and curled up in the loft where it was warmer. He'd thrown extra wool blankets over them, ones that had been packed away for years, not for use but for keeping, like memories sealed in an old trunk. Now the cabin was mostly still, except for the creak of timber and the occasional cough from Little Fern. He hadn't expected this, not really. They were supposed to eat, warm their feet, and move on come morning. That was the way of things in this country. Folks came and went like wind between buttes, but none of them had asked to stay, and none of them looked ready to leave. Boone heard soft steps behind him. He turned but didn't speak. Sadie approached with needle and thread in hand. In her other hand, his old shirt, one he'd torn near the elbow days ago while fixing the corral gate. He hadn't planned on mending it, wasn't worth it. Without a word, Sadie knelt beside him. She shook the shirt out, examined the tear, then threaded her needle. The firelight caught in the fine movement of her fingers. She worked quickly but with care, each stitch placed like she'd been patching broken things her whole life. Boone didn't move. He just watched her. No one had patched something of his since Mary. After a few minutes, the shirt was whole again, roughly sewn but honest. Sadie folded it neatly and placed it on the edge of the chair beside him. Still without speaking, she turned to go. But Boone reached out and caught her hand, not roughly, just enough to make her pause. Her fingers stilled. He held them for a breath. Then, letting go, he said simply, "Thank you." Sadie gave him a nod, almost a bow. Then she returned to the loft. Later that night, Boone heard another shuffle. It was Mabel. She stood near the door, squinting at the draft, where wind had snuck past a cracked shutter. With no fanfare, she picked up a warped plank leaning by the wall and a rusted hammer Boone hadn't touched in years. She bent a nail with her own little weight and drove it home in the 3 slow, deliberate strikes. She glanced back at Boone. He said nothing. She nodded once, returned the hammer, and went back to the others. That was it. Not one word. No permission. No, "Is it okay if I help?" Just action. Quiet, certain, like she believed the cabin was hers to care for, too. By morning, the place had changed in ways Boone couldn't name. The fire hadn't gone out overnight. That hadn't happened in years. There were 4 pairs of tiny boots lined neatly by the door, a 5th pair, the smallest, Fern's, placed on a woven mat made from what looked like cut rags and rope. Josie must have braided it in the night. Boone hadn't noticed. He simply saw it there when he opened the door to fetch wood and paused longer than usual, staring. Then he heard something that hadn't sounded right in this place for a long time. Movement paired with purpose, a home being lived in. At breakfast, Boone cooked more mush and added molasses. Not much, just a finger's worth, but it sweetened the air. The girls ate in silence, but this time it wasn't guarded. It was just early. When he handed Fern her bowl, she looked up at him, eyes wide and unblinking. Then slowly she took the spoon from his hand. Instead of waiting for him to feed her, Tilly gave him a crooked smile and passed her bowl for seconds. Josie placed her hand on the table beside Boone's. She tapped once, twice, then 3 times. A beat, a rhythm, a language. Boone didn't understand it, but he didn't pull away. After the meal, Boone stepped out to chop more wood. Snow had softened the dirt around the chopping stump, making each strike land dull. The axe was still sharp, though, sharper than he'd remembered it being. Behind him, someone tugged gently at his coat. He turned. It was Sadie. She held out his mended shirt, now warm from her hands. Not folded this time, just held. Boone took it from her, his rough fingers brushing hers. He nodded again. This time, deeper. And Sadie did something rare. She smiled. Not a wide grin, not even a full smile, but enough, a sliver of sunlight through a heavy sky. That night, Boone sat by the fire once more, but this time he wasn't alone. Sadie sat near the wall, sewing again. Tilly combed Fern's hair with a piece of bone Boone hadn't known was in the house. Josie laid on her belly, sketching something in the ashes with a stick. Mabel carved at the wood Boone had given her, trying to shape it into a small horse or maybe a dog. No one spoke, but they were together. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, like the hush before rain, like the quiet of belonging. And Boone. He leaned back in his chair, the same chair he once thought he'd die in, and found himself listening to the scratch of Josie's stick, to Tilly's hum, to the creak of logs and the crackle of fire. And he realized something deep in his chest. No one had asked to stay, but they had. Part 5. The Ledger and the Dust-Stained Secret. Morning came quiet. Not the kind of quiet that warns, but the kind that listens. Snow had stopped sometime in the night. The sky was a low, sullen gray, and the hills wore their frost like old coats stitched from years of wind. Boone sat by the stove, nursing his second cup of coffee, steam whispering up like breath from an old mule. Josie, the quietest of them all, stood near the edge of the table. She hadn't eaten, just held a small, worn object in her hands, something Boone hadn't noticed until she stepped closer and offered it to him with both palms. It was a ledger, leather, cracked at the corners, bound by twine instead of a spine. He took it slow, cautious, like it might crumble if touched too hard. He opened it. Inside, pages were thick with coal dust and smudges like it had lived in the bottom of a stove bin. Names were listed, some full, some only, first. Next to them were markings. Traded to Widow Finch, 2 hens. Moved east, claimed by Wagoner. Unfit, returned. Boone's hands gripped the cover tighter. Each name was a child, dozens of them. The margin notes were coded, written in shaky charcoal script, barely legible in places. There were initials, strange signs. Boone didn't recognize all of it, but he understood enough. This wasn't just a list, it was a record of trade, on sale. A ledger of children passed hand to hand like coins and cattle. Sadie stepped up beside Josie now. Her lips were thin, her jaw set tight. "We ran," she said. Her voice didn't tremble, it didn't rise. It just came out like it'd been packed tight for too long. The woman who kept this, Miss Gentry, tried to stop them, tried to hide us. They found out. She didn't make it. Josie still hadn't spoken, but her eyes, black and hard as flint, stayed on Boone's face. He turned the page again. There, almost at the end, were 5 names. The last ones written: Sadie, Mabel, Josie, Tilly, Fern. Next to them, a mark Boone didn't like, a simple X through each. And below them, escaped. Reward posted. Boone closed the book gently. He didn't say a word. But Josie moved to the hearth and sat cross-legged. She picked up a lump of charcoal and began sketching something on the stone floor. Boone didn't look yet. He just watched her hands. Sadie sat again, closer this time. "They're still looking," she said. "We came this way because folks say you don't talk much, that you stay out of town, that nobody bothers Boone Thatcher." Boone stood and walked to the window. Wind was blowing the snow in soft spirals across the slope. Nobody did bother him, until now. He turned, finally glancing down at Josie's drawing. It was a man, standing behind 5 small figures. In front of them was something like a gate, barbed wire and long shadows. And the man's hand? It was open. Boone's voice hadn't been used much that morning, but when it came, it landed heavily. "You trust me to keep this?" Josie nodded. Sadie just said, "It's safer here than out there." Boone sat back down. He looked around the room. The fire, the girls, the ledger. Something had shifted. Not loud, not final, but the kind of shift a man feels deep in the ground beneath him, like the first crack of thaw in the ice. Part 6. The Man from the County Line. 3 days passed in a hush, the kind of hush that settles over snow-draped hills when no one dares speak too loud, afraid it'll stir whatever watches from the dark. Boone Thatcher kept chopping wood and not asking questions. The girls kept to themselves, whispering when they had to, but mostly listening to the wind, to the silence, to Boone's boots scraping the floorboards. Then came the hoofbeats. Mid-morning, the sun still dragging its heels over the pine ridge, a horse appeared over the rise. Not just any horse. This one was white as bone, polished clean, not a fleck of trail dust on its flank. It moved like it knew it was being watched. Riding that horse was too smooth for a mountain country. His coat was tailored, boots polished, spurs more for show than cattle. His badge caught the light, a tin star with the word deputy etched crooked, like it had been hammered in by a drunk blacksmith. Boone watched him from the porch, hand resting on the banister, the old ironwood of it worn down from years of silence. His coffee sat forgotten, steam curling like a dying fire. The man dismounted with a grin too wide for the cold. "Boone Thatcher, I presume," he said, tugging at his gloves like he wasn't in any hurry at all. "Name's Lester Garrity, deputy out of Fallon County. Got myself a warrant signed by Judge Mallard himself." He held out the paper like a salesman offering a contract. He already knew you'd sign. Boone didn't move, didn't blink. Garrity looked past him, eyes scanning the edge of the porch, then the dark window behind Boone's shoulder. "Been hearing things," he said, voice casual. "5 girls went missing from a home down south. Folks real concerned, real upset. Say a man fitting your description was seen near the area." He clicked his tongue. "That you, Boone?" Still no answer. Garrity's eyes kept roaming, never quite meeting Boone's, like he was weighing something. 5 small somethings. "They say one of the girls is mute. One's got a scar under her chin. One's prone to coughing fits." He tapped the edge of his polished boot on the porch rail. "Descriptions line up too clean for coincidence." Boone stepped down the 2 porch steps slowly. His boots thudded like old thunder. "I don't like repeating myself, Mr. Thatcher," Garrity said, shifting his stance just slightly, enough for Boone to notice the glint of a revolver under his coat. Boone didn't speak, but his hand dropped, slow and sure, until it rested on the hilt of the knife hanging from his belt. The gesture wasn't loud, it wasn't fast, but it spoke louder than a rifle crack. Deputy Garrity raised both hands, palms out. Now, he said, "let's not do anything rash. I'm just here to collect what belongs to the county. Those girls are property of the state now. Wards, they call 'em, need to be returned properly." Boone's jaw tightened, but his voice, when it came, was even and cold as the frost on the eaves. "They don't belong to no one." Garrity chuckled. "Sure, you keep telling yourself that. But the law don't care what you think, old man. This ain't about right and wrong. It's about paperwork. And your name ain't on it." From inside the cabin, a soft creak, a floorboard shifting. Garrity's head tilted. "Are they in there?" Boone took 1 step closer. The knife stayed sheathed, but his grip didn't loosen. Garrity started a beat longer, then clicked his tongue again. "Fine, I'll be back. With more ink, more guns, maybe even a preacher to pray over the mess you're about to make." He mounted the white horse, turned it with a flick of his wrist. But before he left, he glanced back, voice softer now. "You can't save 'em all, Thatcher. Ain't nobody that righteous left in this country." The horse's hooves faded down the ridge. Boone stood still long after the dust had settled. Only when the door behind him creaked open did he turn. Sadie stood there, arms crossed tight across her chest, face blank. "He's coming back, isn't he?" Boone looked past her, into the cabin where 5 small lives sat waiting for a choice he hadn't planned to make. "Yeah," he said. Then he closed the door behind him, locked it, and walked to the back room. He didn't speak again that day, but before sundown he was sharpening every blade he owned. Part 7. Cornbread and an Old Coat. The snow didn't fall that night, but the cold pressed in tighter, as if it had heard Garrity's promise and came to see what Boone Thatcher would do with it. Inside the cabin the girls were quieter than usual. Even Fern, who sometimes hummed to herself in sleep, stayed still. The fire burned low, but no one moved to stoke it. Sometimes silence is a kind of shield, and that night each of them wore it like armor. Boone sat at the table long after dark, sharpening his second knife, the one with the hickory handle and 2 notches near the base. He didn't need 2 sharp blades. Truth be told, one was more than he could wield, at his age, in a fight worth surviving. But his hands needed something to do, and sharpening steel was easier than thinking. By dawn his fingers were raw. He walked out back, checked the woodpile, came in again, and for the first time in over 10 years, he opened the top cupboard and brought down the cornmeal. The bag was old. Dust clung to the seams. His wife used to keep it fresher, always rotated by season. She had a way with cornbread, flaky, golden, just sweet enough to remember in spring. Boone didn't remember her recipe, but his hands remembered the feel. He didn't tell the girls what he was doing. He just moved slowly through the kitchen, grinding salt, heating water, mixing with calloused knuckles and the memory of another life. The skillet hadn't been used since the funeral. He scrubbed it without a word, set it on the flame, and watched the batter bubble and settle like breathing. The scent rose before the bread was done. Warm, real, something that didn't belong to silence or loss. It filled the cabin, slow and thick, like steam curling around grief. That's when Tilly came closer. She wasn't the youngest, but she was the smallest. Barefoot, hair like dried wheat, eyes too big for her face. She didn't speak much, and when she did, it was usually in short, half-swallowed phrases. She kept to corners, afraid of fire, it seemed, afraid of too much space, too much eye contact. Boone had seen her flinch when Sadie moved too fast with a broom. But this morning she hovered near the stove, not close enough to reach, just far enough to be near. Boone noticed, but he didn't look her way. He just kept working. When the first loaf was done, he set it on the counter to cool and began cutting slabs with the back of his blade. The crust cracked soft, golden on the edges. The smell deepened. Then, without saying a word, he turned and pulled his old coat from the hook. It was sheepskin lined, worn thin at the shoulders, stained from cattle dust and pine sap. He used to wear it riding fence lines. It hadn't been touched since his daughter's last winter, when she'd asked to sit in it because it smelled like trail and sleep. Boone walked over to Tilly, slowly. No sudden moves. He stooped just slightly, draped the coat over her small shoulders, and stepped back. She didn't run, she didn't speak, but she held the front of the coat shut with both hands and nodded once, the kind of nod that means, "I know." Or maybe, "Thank you." Or maybe something even quieter than that. Fern coughed in her sleep. Sadie watched from the far end of the room, eyes narrow. She didn't speak either. Boone returned to the skillet, made a second batch. This one turned out better. His hands remembered more the second time through. He set plates on the table, 6 of them, and laid the bread without fanfare. Josie appeared beside the hearth, her face pale but curious. She didn't eat right away. She just touched the warm bread with her fingers like she wasn't sure it was real. "Eat," Boone said. One word, nothing more. They did. There wasn't much noise. Just chewing, a few sips of water. the occasional scrape of metal against the old table. But there was a shift, like when the wind changes before a thaw. Boone felt it, but he didn't chase it. He wasn't good at names for things like that. But he knew how to read a trail, and something had turned in the dirt just subtle enough to miss if you weren't paying attention. After breakfast, he took the plates and washed them himself. Tilly sat by the hearth, the coat pulled around her like a second skin. Sadie folded the extra loaf in cloth and tucked it into the cold box. Josie followed Boone outside and handed him the axe before he asked. That day they chopped more wood than they needed. No one said it out loud, but maybe they all figured the man with the white horse might bring fire again. But for now the stove stayed warm. The coat stayed worn. The silence, still there, no longer pressed so heavy. It was the first time Boone didn't feel like the cabin was holding its breath. It was the first time he carved 6 plates instead of 1. Part 8. Shadows by the barn. The wind came back strong that night, high, mean, and dry, as if it hadn't had enough to howl about the last time it passed through. It dragged grit across the windows and rattled the shutters like bones in an old man's hand. Inside, the fire held steady, but the girls slept restless. Every board in the cabin groaned under the weight of things Boone couldn't see. He didn't sleep, not fully, just sat at the window with the lantern low, sharpening a smaller knife now, the one he'd carved meat with when his daughter still liked rabbit stew. His eyes drifted toward the barn more than once. The wind made things move out there. Shadows between fence posts, pitch-black spaces between slats of wood. He told himself it was nothing. But Boone Thatcher was never a man who ignored his gut. He hadn't made peace with the idea of being a protector again. Hell, he still wasn't sure if this, whatever this was more than a long, strange dream, scratched out of snow and ghost fire. But he knew trouble when it slinked past the corner of his land. And trouble didn't always bark when it came. He must have dozed for a moment, just enough to lose track of the dark, because the next sound wasn't the wind. It was Mabel, her bare feet pattering across the floorboards, soft but fast. She was breathing hard, not from fear, but urgency. Boone turned to see her standing in her nightdress, hair wild, hand pointing toward the barn. She didn't speak, just nodded once. Boone rose without a word, took his rifle from the wall. He didn't ask what she saw. A girl like Mabel didn't wake a man unless she was sure. He stepped outside. The cold slapped him fast and hard, like the ridge didn't care how many things a man had already lost. He moved with the wind at his back, using it to cover his steps. Snow had dusted the ridge again, just thin enough to hold a footprint, and there they were, 6 tracks, fresh, pressed in like the weight belonged to someone bigger than Garrity. Boone didn't rush. He studied each boot mark, paused near the barn door, and waited. Nothing moved. No snort from horses, no scuff of heels. He rounded the barn slowly and crouched low by the side wall. That's when he saw it, a single nail, driven halfway into the post. Clean, deliberate, silver, catching a sliver of moonlight. It hadn't been there earlier. Boone was sure of that. He'd built this barn himself, beam by beam. He knew its flaws better than his own joints. He touched the nail, still cold. No hammer left behind, but the strike had been fresh. A quiet message, not for the horses, for him. Just beside the post, boot prints circled the outer fence. Wide steps, close together. No pacing, no sign of rush. Just someone walking with intent, measuring. The same kind of walk a man took around livestock he was thinking of stealing or selling. Boone stayed out there a long while after, not because he thought the man would return, but because he needed to feel the cold, needed to know he wasn't imagining it. He knelt down, pressed his fingers into one of the prints. Then he stood, walked the perimeter, and checked every gate and hinge. Tightened one, reset a latch, reinforced a low spot with a rock. None of it would stop a man who wanted in. But sometimes it wasn't about stopping. Sometimes it was about telling whoever might be watching, "I see you." When he returned to the cabin, Mabel was still awake, still standing where he'd left her. "You did right," Boone said. "Just that." She nodded again. Didn't need more. He poured a bit of hot water from the kettle and left it by her hands. No sugar, no milk, just heat. She took it. He didn't go back to bed. Instead, Boone pulled a chair to the door, sat facing out, rifle leaning against the frame. He thought about the nail, the tracks, the man who'd walked his land like he already owned it. And he thought about how Mabel, quiet Mabel, who never once raised her voice, had been the one to see what he missed. The night passed slowly, the way it always does when a man's watching more than sleeping. And when morning finally came, the light didn't bring peace, just clarity. The threat wasn't just coming, it had already arrived. And if Boone Thatcher had any say in it, it wasn't going to walk out again with what belonged to this house. Not the girls, not this ground, not a single damn thing. Part 9. Fire from the outside. The first gray light of dawn had barely touched the frozen ground when Boone Thatcher sensed it. A heat at the edge of knowing, a low, suffocating heat that didn't belong in winter. He found it first by the barn. Flames licked out from between rotten boards, coiling against the wood roof like angry snakes. A gust of wind caught embers and threw them across the yard, flickers of menace that danced toward the cabin's eaves. The girls were already awake, voices quiet but sharp with panic. Sadie stood firm by the loft ladder, holding Josie tight against her. Fern, tears staining her cheeks, clutched Tilly's arm. Boone rushed forward, boots crunching over snow and ash, his breath tight in his chest, every muscle ready. The fire crackled, dangerously confident. "Inside," he barked, voice louder than he'd meant. But fear didn't wait for softness. The girls scrambled down, obeying without words. Boone grabbed the bucket by the door, the bucket he had filled hours before, and rushed water across the flames. Each hiss and sputter sounded like the wood's cry, the barn bending under its own betrayal. He repeated the rinse. Salted tears blended with sweat on his pale face. He dipped again and again until the edges of the fire went dull. Smoke billowed into the sky like black prayers for rebirth. When it was out, the barn stood limp, charred but intact. Boone leaned, covered in ash and regret, staring at what remained of his sanctuary, built by his sweat, now bending under ruin. Sadie came forward with forest soil in her hands. She tossed it on the hot logs. More of the girls followed. Quietly, side by side, they helped smother the remaining glow, turning fear into closure. Boone closed his eyes. The barn's smell, cottonwood char, soot, pressed into his lungs. He shook his head, as if waking from a disturbing dream. He turned to the girls. This six-strong circle huddled together, faces dim in smoke-choked light. He said nothing. Just lit another match for the hearth, coaxed the fire back to life, and stood aside until it glowed steady. Then he handed out bowls of lukewarm stew, flavored by soot, artful in its necessity. The next few days were quieter. The barn survived, though it bore scars. Boone patched it with fresh board and the hard nails, his hands again steady. The girls helped him, each hammer stroke lightened by collaboration, a sound full of purpose. At night, Tilly curled up in the old coat Boone had given her. Josie leaned against his leg, her unfinished charcoal sketch still clinging to the floor. Mabel placed a carved horseshoe on the mantel, gift or remembrance, he couldn't say, and Boone sat in silence that felt full, not of loss, but of belonging, because some fires destroy and some forge what stays. Part 10. The Cross That Stayed Standing. Snow came late that year. It drifted in thin, idle veils across the ridge, never sure if it meant to stay. The ground stayed cold, but not frozen. The kind of soil that gives a man choices, if he's willing to touch it again. Boone Thatcher stood by the birchwood cross he'd carved weeks ago. Its shape was still true, though the wind had leaned it a little off-center. It wasn't the first time he'd come out to this patch of earth, but it was the first time he carried the hammer with him instead of the shovel. He didn't speak. Didn't have to. The girls stayed back by the porch. 5 quiet shapes, wrapped in mismatched coats. They didn't ask what he was doing. They seemed to understand already. Boone knelt and pulled the cross from where it had once marked the place he meant to die. Then he carried it, not to the ridge where he used to watch the sun vanish, but to the well where morning light broke clean over the frost. The girls followed at a distance, Sadie holding Fern's hand, Josie limping slightly from stepping on a nail 2 days before. Mabel had a little pail filled with mustard seeds. No one said a word. No one needed to. Boone drove the cross into the soil with 3 sure strikes. No prayer, just breath visible in the cold, curling like something forgiven. Then he pulled out his knife and scraped off the old inscription, "I once had a family." He stared at the bare grain for a long while, then carved new words. The strokes were slow, almost reverent. "This is a beginning, not an end." Josie came up first. She knelt and pressed a flat stone at the base. A drawing marked in soot. 5 stick figures under a crooked roof. One taller beside them. Boone didn't look down. He couldn't, just yet. Sadie knelt next, her hands shaking slightly from the cold. She opened the pouch of mustard seeds and began planting them in a semicircle around the base of the cross. Boone watched as the soil accepted each one. Small things buried deep in dirt not meant for easy growing. But that was the land's way. It never promised to be gentle, just honest. Mabel followed, placing 3 pine cones at the edge of the circle. "So the squirrels know someone lives here now," she said, soft as breath. Fern, too young to really understand, offered her broken doll, laid it gently at the root of the cross. Boone started to protest, but then stopped. He nodded instead. Tilly came last. She didn't place anything down. She just touched the wood and said, "Thank you." It was the first time she'd spoken since the fire. Boone's knees cracked as he stood. The cold bit through his coat, but his hands were warm. From the earth, from work, from them. He looked out over his land. It didn't look like much to most folks. Wind scraped hard in places, too quiet in others. But for the first time in 10 years, he wasn't waiting for it to take him. He was staying to tend it. Later that evening, by the fire, Boone took out the old pocket knife he hadn't used in a long while. Not for carving, only for defending, surviving. He held it a moment, weighed it, then began shaping 6 little blocks of pine. Not for coffins, for cups. Part 11. The sheriff who still knew. Right from wrong. Boone Thatcher rode into town under a sky so pale it could have been carved from bone. He guided the mare, steady but burdened, and behind him strapped his rifle, sturdy as the truth that wouldn't let him lie still. The ledger rested beneath his coat, dust-stained but heavy with names that weighed on him more than any rifle ever could. Entering the sheriff's office, Boone found Sheriff Luther Cade, seated behind a desk of worn pine. Buttons on his coat dull, yes, but eyes sharp like flint in candlelight. The sheriff was a gray-haired man, used to watching sin break on the prairie and still stand upright. Boone nodded, placing the ledger on the desk without preamble. Cade looked up, studied the leather cover and the stiff spine. "What you got there, Boone?" he asked, voice steady with years of calling trouble by its full name. Boone said nothing at first, just watched the sheriff open it, Cattle rustling logs, town ledgers, they'd all seen use. But this was a trade route nobody drew lines across. Names of children, coded columns, boomed fault lines where there should have been shelter. Cade's face went still. His weathered fingers traced the charcoal marks. After a long silence, he closed the book. This is worth bleeding for, he said, voice low enough. Boone could almost feel it vibrate through his boots. Boone inhaled once. They come for him, Boone said. Garrity's got orders. He plans to bring guns. Cade leaned back, arms folding. His posture was rigid, resolute. Then we need to fill the woods with watchfires. Cover every trail into Town Hollow. Make it so people know. Cross this land and they'll face more than cold wind. Boone nodded, chest tight. The gesture was small. No fanfare, but Cade's words struck deeper than any shot. Cade stood and rapped the ledger shut. I knew this land needed saving when I first rode into it. He tapped the desk. But a man like Garrity thinks that law ends at a signature. This question mark. This is just the law refusing to die. He gave Boone the ledger back. You keep this, and if Garrity brings guns, you bring this out and show it like it can't lie, and maybe someone will listen. The sheriff's gaze lingered. Then he flicked a switch and lit the lamps around the room one by one. Shadows fell back, clarity spread. Boone rose to leave. Cade said quietly as Boone turned to the door, You ever lose your way, come by. I'll meet you, with people who still remember what's just. Outside, snow fell faintly. Boone heard the whisper of it, carried faint across the high ridge. Riding back to the cabin, he sighted them. Sadie, Josie, Mabel, Tilly, Fern, standing by the cross, bundled against the chill. He drew the mare to a stop. Sadie approached, eyes steady. Did you get it? Boone offered the ledger, closed but firm. She touched it gently. I believe you, she said, voice barely above breath. Boone nodded. Inside, Josie sketched again, this time on paper, 5 figures under a moon. Fern pressed her hand into his cold fingers, warmer hope. Mabel and Tilly leaned close, no words, just presence. Boone's badge of grief could have been shackles or wings. He chose wings. Part 12. The Trap That Didn't Hold. They came before noon. Garrity wasn't wearing a badge anymore, just a long coat too fine for trail dust and a pistol slung high, like a man who needed others to see it. He brought 4 more with him, none from town, hired hands, lean, cracked men with eyes that didn't blink much. One carried a Henry rifle with notches in the stock. Another chewed tobacco like he didn't even taste it. None looked like they came to talk. Boone watched from the shade of the porch. His hands were still. No trembling, no rush. He'd been waiting 3 nights for this. The coal cellars were stocked. The back trail lined with mesquite brush. The cabin swept clean, fire banked, and the girls already inside. Sadie had led them to the root cellar herself. A hatch under the kitchen floor, hidden beneath a faded rug. The cellar was cold, dirt-packed, once used for coal and potatoes. Now it held 5 children and a single lantern, the kind with smoked glass. Stay low, Sadie had whispered. She placed herself between the others and the steps, arms wide like a gate. Boone didn't speak as Garrity rode up, just stepped off the porch and let his boots settle in the dust. The winter sun was sharp, casting long silhouettes across the dirt yard. Boone, Garrity called, smiling like a dry well. Heard you got yourself a little orphanage. Real charitable of you. Boone said nothing. Garrity shrugged. They're mine, you know. Property of the county, wards of the state. You harboring fugitives now. Still Boone didn't speak. His hand rested easy at his hip, close but not desperate. One of Garrity's men shifted in the saddle. the Henry rifleman. He squinted. "Ain't no kids here," Boone said finally. "Just me and the wind." Garrity's smile soured. "Search the place." The men dismounted. Boots hit earth. Dust rose. They made it 2 steps toward the porch before Boone lifted the Winchester. He didn't aim it. He didn't have to. "Don't," he said. "Just that." The men paused. One spat. "You gonna shoot all of us, Boone?" Garrity asked, one brow raised. Boone stared. His silence was the kind that could crush a man. From the roofline, a hawk called. Wind shifted, and then Garrity made his mistake. He stepped forward, drawing the whip from his belt. Not the gun, the whip. He cracked it once in the air. "Come out!" he barked toward the house. The sound snapped through the valley. Boone didn't flinch, but the whip's end had curled toward the window. Inside, Mabel had screamed. A small one, barely louder than a gasp. That was enough. Boone lifted the Winchester and fired, not at the men, but at the loft beam above Garrity's head. It split. Black dust rained down, fine coal soot, packed over years, released in a cloud. The men staggered, coughing, eyes burning. Garrity shouted. Another drew a pistol blindly. Boone shot the pistol from his hand. When the dust cleared, 2 of Garrity's men had dropped their rifles. The others backed away, spooked like wild mules. Boone stepped forward. "You brought fire," he said, voice low. "Now take your ashes." Garrity looked around, seeing loyalty dissolve in soot, and for the first time his voice held fear. "You ain't gonna get away with this." Boone holstered the rifle. Already did. And from behind him the cabin door creaked. Sadie stood there, the girls behind her, not hiding anymore. The trap had sprung, and the only ones caught were the men who thought silence meant weakness. Part 13. What's left? After the smoke clears. The wind had settled by the time the sun crested over the ridge, its light slanting down onto a ranch that had survived more than it was ever meant to. Smoke still hung faint in the sky, thin trails curling upward from charred barn boards and singed sagebrush. But the worst of it was over. The fight had passed, leaving behind silence, ash, and something heavier. Change. Boone stood on the front steps, hat in hand, watching Sheriff Cade and 2 deputies tie Garrity's wrists with rawhide. Garrity didn't fight now. There was no menace left in him, only the slack-jawed stare of a man who'd gambled his cruelty and lost. Boone didn't say a word, didn't spit or curse. He simply watched the dust rise as the posse led the deputy away. Sadie came out quietly behind him, one of the quilts Boone's late wife had made draped over her shoulders. She didn't ask what would happen to the man. Maybe she already knew. That afternoon, word reached town. By nightfall, the hidden truths of the orphan ledger had made their way through the post office, the church pews, the general store. No one said much, not at first, but folks noticed when the Reverend began riding toward Town Hollow with a Bible tucked under his arm. They noticed when Mrs. Hargrove, who had never adopted a soul in her life, sent up a box of books and pencils. The ripple was slow, but sure. Boone sat on the porch that evening with a whittling knife and a block of pine, hands steady for the first time in weeks. The girls had taken to drawing in the dirt, playing hop circles, dragging makeshift dolls made of rags. Tilly laughed, real and free, when Mabel tried to spell her name with pebbles. Josie sat nearby with Boone's old ledger in her lap, not the one from the orphan ring, but the one with fencing orders and seed dates. Her fingers traced the lines like she was learning how a ranch breathes. Boone watched her for a moment, then pulled something from his pocket. A string. He handed it to Josie. It wasn't fancy, just twine. But Josie's eyes lit up like it was silver thread. She looped it around her fingers and started making shapes, stories, signs. Boone said, "Teach me that." Josie smiled and nodded. For the first time, Boone began learning how to speak without sound. Not to order, not to warn, but to understand. Later that week, Mabel showed him a sheet of paper, her name, written crooked but proud. Fern, who used to flinch at every loud noise, now chased after the hens barefoot, laughing like she'd never known fear. And Sadie, still quiet and watchful, sat every night near Boone's rocker, carving small animals from leftover wood scraps. The cabin that once echoed with ghosts now held life. Not one of them spoke of what came before. Not Garrity, not the ledger, not the hunger, or running. The past had teeth, and they'd all been bitten. But somehow, in this hard-earned hush, the scars didn't scream so loud. That night, Boone added a 6th cup to the shelf above the hearth, not for a ghost, for someone still here. Part 14. 6 wooden cups and a fire still burning. The sky stretched wide and soft over the hills, and for the first time in years, Boone Thatcher didn't start his morning with the weight of silence pressing down like frost. Instead, he carved. On the worn table, where time had left its grooves, sat 6 wooden cups, each one smoothed by his hands, shaped with quiet purpose. He poured tea into all of them. No one else in the room, not yet, but he poured just the same. The cabin smelled of pine shavings and dried mint. Boone had taken to planting now, not because the soil promised bounty, but because life had stopped asking for permission. Rows of onions lined the path to the barn, mint near the back window. A stubborn rosemary bush grew where the cross had once stood, roots deep in what was once meant to be a grave. The fireplace still burned every morning, not from cold, but out of ritual. The girls would wander out one by one, Sadie always first, quiet but alert, Mabel with her hands still smudged from some half-finished project, Josie with her notebook tucked under arm, Tilly trailing a book or a question, and little Fern, barefoot and half asleep, always finding Boone first to rest her head on his leg. There was no more talk of before. The girls didn't ask about his son, and Boone didn't pry about what each of them had endured. It was a pact unspoken but firm. What mattered was what came next. On the far wall above the table hung a drawing Josie had made, charcoal on parchment, wrinkled and thumb-stained. It showed a tall man beneath a tree, 5 rays of sunlight branching from behind him, except they weren't rays. They were children, arms outstretched, smiles sketched with bold lines. In the corner, Josie had signed it in block letters, Home. Boone had stood there the first time he saw it and hadn't said a word, just nodded, hand resting on the wall, eyes fixed on the firelight that flickered across the image. That night he added a seiki, 6th cup to the set. Now, when townsfolk came by the ranch for a horseshoe repaired, a bolt of cloth dropped off, a lost dog returned, they didn't ask about the girls. They nodded, tipped their hats, sometimes left food by the porch. The sheriff never spoke of what happened that night with Garrity, but the roads into Town Hollow stayed watched. Word traveled, and it stopped traveling fast. Whatever business had once run in the dark now wilted like a cut weed. Some days, Boone still walked the ridge behind the cabin, not to dig, just to look. That grave-shaped hole had long been filled in with dirt, flowers, and a few scattered toys. Life had returned not like thunder, but like mist lifting off morning grass. And when he sat with the girls, hands wrapped around warm wood and soft laughter nearby, Boone Thatcher realized he hadn't just been saved. He'd been seen, chosen. In the silence, something had spoken back, and for the first time in a long, long time, he stayed. The fire still burns in that quiet cabin on the hill, not as a warning, not to keep the cold out, but as a small promise that even the most broken places can hold light again. And maybe that's all some folks need, not saving, not answers, just a reason to pause, a roof to sit under, a silence shared. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a loss, or a moment you thought was too small to matter, feel free to leave a note below. Sometimes even strangers on the trail leave behind something worth picking up. Thanks for riding along.